Did you know that Thomas Jefferson was obsessed with Old English? Not only did he read it frequently and assemble what was at the time by far the largest and most impressive Old English library in the Americas, he wrote about it often, advocated for its study and inclusion in the language program at UVA, and in 1776 he even proposed that Hengist and Horsa be included on the Great Seal of the United States of America. He was the first American Old English scholar. And while I would love to tell you that my country's relationship with Old English started off on a good foot, unfortunately Jefferson may have also been the worst American Old English scholar, and perhaps the worst Germanic philologist of all time. In today's video, I'd like to go over with you what he had to say on the language, and I think you'll find that not only was his understanding of Old English comically bad, he actively advocated against progress in its understanding, and some of what he wrote was just so hilariously wrong that I figured I had to share it with you today. Stay tuned. Jefferson first encountered Old English in his capacity as a law student. Studying under another founding father, George Wythe, Jefferson became very interested in the legal history of checks and balances on a monarchy, which might not surprise you. That led him to reading a 15th century book titled The Difference Between an Absolute and Limited Monarchy. The preface of that book was written several centuries later by an English lawyer named Sir John Fortescue Allen, who spent about 40 pages explaining why it was important for lawyers to learn Old English. Allen, along with many other legal scholars of the time, was a proponent of what we now call the Saxon myth, the idea that the Germanic peoples are just sort of by nature more democratic and egalitarian, as described by the first century Roman historian Tacitus, and therefore it makes sense that the English need a parliament. In this lens, feudalism and absolute monarchy were unnatural French importations, which had to be fixed by advances like the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution, which curbed the power of the monarch. Jefferson, as an American, saw the revolution as the next step in reclaiming this sort of Saxon ideal, hence why he wanted to include Hengist and Horsa on the American seal. Whether or not there is any truth to the Saxon myth is a topic for another video, but for Jefferson the consequence was that he became very interested in reading the Old English laws, and actually quoted them in his legal writings. For example, in 1778, he proposed a series of legal reforms in Virginia which were aimed at reducing the amount of crimes that were considered capital offenses. It's a bit hard to read, but here Jefferson is proposing that Virginia reduce the penalty for forgery to a non-capital offense, punishable instead by 6 years of hard labor. In his notes, he cites the laws of Athelstan, in which forgery was punished by cutting off the hand. Later, he says under Athelred, it was upgraded to a capital offense, and it remained so into Virginian common law. It seems that Jefferson is bringing up this history in an attempt to demonstrate that the sort of Saxon spirit was originally opposed to execution for this particular crime, and that society should return to that Saxon ideal by making it once more a non-capital offense. This is, however, a rare example for Jefferson's study of Old English in his earlier years. I'm not sure how well you know your American history, but the late 1700s were a bit hectic, and in 1798 Jefferson complained that he had never had enough time to truly study the language. It wasn't until after his presidency that he took a step back from politics and dedicated himself to more academic pursuits, such as the establishment of the University of Virginia. While it will forever sit in the shadow of the great University of Maryland, the University of Virginia holds a strong place in Old English studies today. For several decades, it was the home of now Emeritus Professor Peter Baker, who many of you will know as the author of the Old English translation of Alice in Wonderland, as well as an influential grammar that has an accompanying website, which is probably the single most useful Old English learning tool online. Today, UVA houses Stephen Hopkins, whom I recently interviewed on this channel about his excellent new book on Apocrypha. Hopkins also runs a pretty great Twitter account and is a good name to follow in the future of Old English scholarship. If you could go back in time and tell Thomas Jefferson that two big names in the sphere of Old English academia were associated with UVA, he would be elated. Establishing Old English as a legitimate language taught at the university was a big goal for him, and in 1818 he wrote an essay to the university, explaining what Old English was, why it was important, and how students should study it. Now, when Jefferson reads Old English laws and quotes them in his notes, it seems generally that he understands what is being said, and up until this point we haven't really had any cause to doubt his understanding of the language. This essay, however, is where the cracks begin to appear. He starts on a high note. In most 18th century publications, quotations of Old English actually used the insular script that the scribes used, which made it a lot harder to read. Jefferson's first point is that Old English should be written in a modern font, in order to remove entirely the first discouraging obstacle to the general study of the Anglo-Saxon. Here I agree with him, and so do most modern editors. This is the manuscript of the Wanderer poem, and this is the edition you'll read nowadays, much less intimidating. Don't get me wrong, I think someone who wants to master Old English absolutely needs to learn how to read the manuscripts. But for someone who just wants to read a few of the texts in their original language, I just don't think it's necessary to introduce that difficulty. Seeing editions like this made widely available would have also been a source of great joy for Jefferson. From there, however, it's all downhill. His next point is that because the early medieval English are also profoundly illiterate, when a scribe wanted to spell a word, he brought together therefore those letters which he supposed must enter into the composition of the sound he meant to express, and was not even particular in arranging them in the order in which the sounds composing the word followed each other. That is, Jefferson thought that Old English scribes were sitting down, thinking of all the sounds in a word, thinking of the letters that went into those sounds, and then just sort of mashing them all together and calling it a day. Hilariously, the examples he uses are all consistently examples of a linguistic phenomenon we call metathesis, which generally means when two sounds switch places. The word for grass in Old English was gars, but by the 12th century, we start seeing spellings of GRAS, which show that metathesis had taken place. The A and the R sound had switched places. The same thing is true for bird, which was brid, cart, which was krat, and run, which was irnan, which itself was a metathesized form of rinnan. Many dialects of modern English have unique metathesis in words such as ask, which some people pronounce as axe. The s and k sound switch places. Old English orthography was semi-phonetic, meaning that more often than nowadays, people would just spell words the way they sounded them out. Therefore, in Old English, we typically see metathesis attested in words which the scribe, him or herself, actually pronounces that way, so it's not just random. Things go from bad to worse in the next sentence when Jefferson writes that they seemed to suppose, too, that a final vowel was necessary to give sound to the consonant preceding it, and they used for that purpose any vowel indifferently. Orthography in Old English is definitely not simple. There's a lot of variation across dialects and time periods, mostly because, as we just said, people pronounced words differently. For example, if I were using a more phonetic orthography, I probably would have no cause to change how I spelled the word car. But to someone in England, that word is ka, and if they were to write the word, they actually might omit the R letter because they don't pronounce it. So if you were to compare the fact that I had written C-A-R and an English person had written C-A, that doesn't mean that neither of us care about spelling, it means that we pronounce the words differently. The same thing is true in Old English. Just because you see a variety of vowels in the final position of a word doesn't mean that variety is meaningless, and it certainly doesn't mean that those vowels didn't exist. This is not to mention inflectional endings. He gives the example of sunu, meaning sun, being spelled S-U-N-E, which is just an example of that final vowel being reduced to in late Old English. And he gives an example of it being spelled S-U-N-A, but that's the inflected form. That final actually means that the noun is not in the nominative or accusative singular. It has semantic value. This leads Jefferson to the conclusion that we cannot hope to pronounce Old English correctly, because were we to regard the powers of the letters only, no human organ could articulate their uncouth jumble. Consequently, he recommends pronouncing it as if it were modern English. So what becomes what, sunu becomes sun, agen becomes own, etc. This proposition is somewhat forgivable because it actually mirrors the way that Jefferson pronounced Latin. English speakers of his time used the traditional English-Latin pronunciation system, which was basically just English phonetics applied to the Latin language. For example, Caesar's famous opening line in the Gallic commentaries becomes Gallia est omnis divisa in partes trees. The first line of the Aeneid becomes Arma virum qui cano, Troi quae primus ab oris, and I won't tell you how they pronounce the word for queen. So the logic is defensible even if it is largely unsustainable in Old English. The language has just changed so much that were we to apply modern English phonology onto Old English, We would practically have to translate the Old English into modern English in order to do so, and at that point, just translate it. If you want to read Old English, I think there's really no point in not learning how to actually pronounce Old English. But the rest of the essay concerns not pronunciation, rather grammar, and here is where we really get off the rails. We might say that the first Old English textbook was written by the English antiquarian George Hicks, who preceded Jefferson by about 100 years and was the first person to really outline the rules of the language. That is, he demonstrated that a word like "these," this, had a masculine, neuter, and feminine form for the nominative, accusative, genitive, and dative cases in the singular and in the plural. Jefferson thought that this was largely hallucinated in a misguided attempt to give Old English the prestige of Latin and Greek. He confidently rebukes Hicks, saying that Old English adjectives had no changes of termination on account of gender, number, or case. What? He continues, to ascribe gender to nouns in such a case would be to embarrass the learner with unmeaning and useless distinctions. What? I never thought that one day I would have to prove that Old English nouns had grammatical gender, but here is a passage from the Old English Boethius, of which Jefferson had a copy, and right here we can see "these" as the neuter accusative singular for "leuth," a neuter noun, and "leaf," another neuter noun here in the genitive "leaves," is accompanied by the neuter genitive singular "theses." But here, the word erde, which is feminine, is in the accusative, and is therefore accompanied by the feminine accusative singular, thos. When it appears in the genitive, here, it's accompanied by the feminine genitive singular, which is these. I can't make fun of someone for not independently noticing these things and discovering these connections on their own, but when someone else goes through the trouble of pointing it out for you, and your reaction is just, "nah-uh," I don't know what else there is to say. Jefferson is so blinded by the ideological notion that Old English should be a simple, recognizable language that he's actively denying obvious truths. He goes on to say, we must guard against the conclusion of Dr. Hicks that the change of termination in the Anglo-Saxon adjectives as god, which is the strong nominative form, gode, which is the weak neuter and feminine nominative form, for example, is an indication of gender. This, like others of his examples of inflection, is only an instance of unsettled orthography. So he genuinely thinks that the Old English inflectional endings were just garbled nonsense coughed up by confused, illiterate scribes. I mean, again, I can't fault someone from that time for thinking this after just reading Old English, but when someone else points out the obvious connections to you, there's just no excuse for this level of ignorance. This goes on and on for a few more pages of rage bait until we get to the best part of the essay, an enormous postscript added in 1825. Jefferson has just read Joseph Bosworth's Elements of Anglo-Saxon Grammar, which was an excellent step forward in the field, and he didn't have much good to say about it. He writes, I was disappointed on finding that in proportion as he has advanced on and beyond the footsteps of his predecessors, he has the more embarrassed the language with rules and distinctions in imitation of the grammars of Greek and Latin, has led it still further from its genuine type of Old English, and increased its difficulties by the multitude and variety of new and minute rules with which he has charged it. That is to say, he has actually elucidated the grammar of Old English. Jefferson then gives us his funniest quote yet, complaining that Bosworth proceeds, in conformity with preceding authorities, which indeed support him, to make genders, cases, and declensions of nouns to depend on their terminating vowel, the formations of different parts of verbs to depend on the collocation of the letters and other formations, and even regimen to depend on the final syllable, and this leads to such an infinitude of minute rules and observances as are beyond the power of any human memory to retain. If indeed this be the true genius of the Anglo-Saxon language, then its difficulties go beyond its worth, and render a knowledge of it no longer a compensation for the time and labor its acquisition will require, and in that case I would recommend its abandonment in our university as an unattainable and unprofitable pursuit. Well, don't tell that to Peter Baker or Stephen Hopkins. Maybe Jefferson would actually not be happy to hear of Baker's association with UVA, given that his grammar and website have guided thousands, including myself, to commit to memory that which Jefferson describes as being beyond the power of any human memory to retain. But he assures the reader that Bosworth is definitely wrong, and he expresses the hope that Old English scholarship can move past these foolish things like grammar. The strangest part about all of this is that Jefferson had an incredible mastery of Greek and Latin. He knew inflected languages, but he never learned German or Dutch or any Scandinavian language, and he seems to have thought that inflection in general, beyond the very basics like the S's in that guy's dogs, was just unnatural to the Germanic languages and applied in vain to Old English. You might be wondering, if he didn't believe in Old English grammar, how could he read Old English? Well, he shows us exactly how well he can read Old English in the remainder of the postscript, in which he includes his translation of part of Alfred's Genesis. Let's check out line 225, which in Old English reads, He warun tha bu tu nakode, Adam on his weave, on him thas ne shomode. That is, of course, they were both naked, Adam and his wife, and they were not ashamed of it. Jefferson gets the first couple words right, but he gives the last bit as, and they then is nay ashamed. His refusal to acknowledge thas as the masculine and neuter genitive singular form of that has led him to reinterpret the word as then is, which gives him the ridiculous translation, they is nay ashamed. It's not hard to see why he thought the Old English were too stupid to spell correctly if he thought their Bible translations had sentences like this. But at the end of the day, thas is not then is, but of that. They were not ashamed of that. And the only person here who looks illiterate is Thomas Jefferson. The translation goes on, filled with these kinds of mistakes, and Jefferson actually died before he drew the postscript, which is actually more than 4 times larger than the essay itself, to any sort of conclusion. I want to say that I didn't make this video because I wanted to dunk on Thomas Jefferson, and in general I think there's no point in making fun of historical scholars for just not knowing things that we know now. I don't make fun of Tolkien for thinking that Beowulf meant Beowulf, because no one at the time had figured out that it didn't yet, and I certainly don't think I would have been able to figure it out on my own. What I do think it's fair to judge historical scholars on is their love of the truth, and how much they allow romantic biases to stifle the logical process of argumentation. This is especially true when they have contemporaries who aren't under these illusions, like Bosworth and Hicks, who effectively demonstrated that there are grammatical inflections in Old English. Jefferson just didn't want it to be true, and at the end of the day, he came across as looking foolish. So for all scholars of any kind, I think that today our takeaway has to be that in real good scholarship, there can be no agendas or ideologies, just the truth, and the various facts that make up that truth. The study of Old English is no exception. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you like content like this, be sure to check out the rest of the channel, kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon, and until next time, Fara Thier Isunde.